Welcome back to part two of tonight's broadcast in conversation with myself, Inayat Wadi, right here on Salam Media. And the next hour of the show is going to be dedicated to the United Nations. Now, many of us know by now that on the 17th of November, the Security Council had adopted Resolution 2803, which basically entrenched Israel's unlawful occupation of Gaza. And what is worse is by adding a foreign colonial layer of control over Gaza. And this has raised many a question whether the United Nations has abandoned Palestinian rights to safeguard the unlawful occupation by Israel. Is this a denial of the right to Palestinians to their self-determination? And it obviously many more questions that have been raised. Now, to unpack all of this, we are joined by two very esteemed guests this evening right here on Salam Media, and they need no introduction on a global level as well. We are joined by Mr. Sam Husseini, and also when one looks at obviously he's been quite vocal on the issue of Palestine. He's been a writer as well, and also a political activist as well. And also will be joined by Raji Surani, who is the founder of the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. Mr. Sam Husseini and also Mr. Raji Surani, to both of you, we welcome you to the show. We do appreciate you taking time out. We thank you for your time with us right here on Salam Media.
Thank you, Salam.
Yes. Now, just starting with you, Mr. Husseini, to talk about this Security Council resolution. And clearly, this is a Trump peace plan. It clearly violates the UN Charter, and it has raised a lot more questions than answers since this resolution was adopted.
Yes, it was a remarkable UN Security Council resolution. I'm not surprised by much, but I was surprised by how brazen this was in its adoption of the so-called Trump plan. The U.S. ambassador basically told the Security Council, pass this or the full-scale genocide will continue. So it was clearly done under coercion, although I think that the various Security Council members need to be criticized heavily for allowing it to pass. But fundamentally, it blesses this US-dominated process. It does not call for UN peacekeepers to go in. It calls for this so-called International Stabilization Force, which is under this Board of Peace, headed by none other than Donald Trump himself, and Tony Blair is the other party that was named to this. Tony Blair, of course, was largely an architect of the horrific Iraq invasion, and he's tried to get his hands into Gaza in the past, as I'm sure Dr. Surani will recall, with the so-called quartet several years ago with Gaza. But the fundamentals of this are to sanctify this plan to effectively, for the time being, divide Gaza, to cooperate with Israel, to possibly have a force that could even be a juiced up version of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. It pretends to be about a sort of ceasefire, but as we've seen, Israel is continuing to kill Palestinians on a daily basis. It's killed several today. So that's the broad outline of this.
Yes, and we'll ask Dr. Raji Surani to also comment on this. Dr. Surani, what do you make of these foreign design governing structures, especially after coming 2 years out of a genocide, one of the worst that we've actually seen at this point in time? And, how does one actually look at this? Is this an insult to the people of Palestine? Because once again, one of the key issues, and we can break it down, is the denial of the Palestinians and their right to self-determination.
Well, I think 17th of November will be remembered as one of the darkest days for Palestinian people. This UN Security Council resolution, unprecedented, so sad, bad, ugly, to have from the Security Council the place which designated to be the place of keeping word, security and peace, a place to keep UN resolution guaranteed to be implemented, the place where international law, international humanitarian law, and the human rights should be respected, and all the resolutions of the UN should be respected and implemented. It is the body who violated the international peace and security, who violated international law, who deleted 80 years of Palestinian political and legal harvest. All Security Council resolutions, all UN resolutions related to the international legitimacy, deleted with this resolution. I almost can't believe this had happened. And it's a nightmare for any who knows ABC of international legitimacy, for those who know the ABC of rule of law. It looks like the conflict began on October 7th, 2023, which is totally wrong and stupid. There is no word, not a single word, about the Israeli criminal belligerent occupation, the occupation who commit war crimes, crimes against humanity, persecution, apartheid, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. No word talking about ending the occupation. No word addressing this, which is the real cause of the conflict since Nakba till today. There is no word about Palestinian right of self-determination. No word about the unalienable rights of the Palestinian people. There is no word as well about international law, international humanitarian law. No word whatsoever about ending the genocide or ethnic cleansing, which is till this moment going on. There is no word about accountability, about rule of law. It's unprecedented that US do lead that, and no veto has been used by Russia or China or even Algeria per se as a representative of the Arab world and the Islamic world in the Security Council. So it's very dangerous. It just doesn't mention as well one word about West Bank or Palestine or Palestinian legitimate representative or Palestinian people. It's Kafka when Israel has been shown as the victim. The criminal belligerent occupation looked as the victim, and we, the Palestinian people, the freedom fighters, those who legitimately struggling for their right of self-determination, independence, not mentioned or stated our legal and political rights. So it's one of the most dangerous decisions, which is totally, from my perspective, do contradict the ABC of the UN Charter itself, and it contradicts the basic principles of the UN. It's
Well, certainly,
rewarding the
Dr. Surani.
genocidal. Sorry?
Yes, I'd just like Mr. Husseini to comment because, you make a very telling statement where we talk about, instead of ending the occupation, Mr. Husseini, this resolution that was passed is actually entrenching the occupation with a foreign control. And also, I think what Mr. Surani is saying is the veto power, because we've seen in the last 2 years of the genocide, we've seen how the United States has utilized its veto power. And one would have expected, at the very least, some of the countries, like, for example, the countries that abstained, China, Russia, possibly using a veto power as well to so that this resolution doesn't actually go through. So what does this actually tell us about a world order, particularly when one looks at the UN Security Council and a resolution of this nature is actually passed? Just how sincere are these countries in their support for Palestine, for Palestinian self-determination, for ending the occupation of Palestine?
No, most governments simply provide rhetoric without meaningful action. And we knew that going into this. We also knew, I wrote my first article advocating the invoking of the Genocide Convention back in 2014 during the massive assault then. And then I pushed hard for it from October to December of 2023, some 10 years later. And then South Africa invoked it. From the first time I wrote about it, I wrote it as a two-step process. That is, first a country invokes the Genocide Convention and gets orders from the International Court of Justice. It would then go to the Security Council. The U.S. would veto or block or hinder in some way any meaningful resolution. And then you had to do a Uniting for Peace resolution with 2/3 of the members of the General Assembly. That never happened. Or that never meaningfully happened. You never had a resolution put forward with meaningful provisions. You just had perfunctory resolutions calling for a ceasefire or something like that. And you have 150 countries voting for such resolutions. That and a little bit of money will get you a cup of coffee. What you didn't have was resolutions calling for a protection force, calling for sanctions on Israel, and so on. Colombia started saying that it would make such a move a couple of months ago. I think that might have precipitated this so-called Trump plan. The disaster of this is that I believe that the global movement in solidarity with Palestine had an opening. It had a chance to pressure various countries to act on their rhetoric to get a UN General Assembly Uniting for Peace resolution with concrete measures through the General Assembly, and it failed to do that. It failed to meaningfully push for that. Various groups I can point to, Progressive International and others, had ample opportunity to help fulfill that. I think a lot of people were taken in by this process. And I should say it's a very bipartisan process in the United States. I should emphasize what Trump did here was basically a order of magnitude higher, but basically the same structure as what Biden did in 2024. I said I was surprised by the nature of this resolution. What I was surprised by was the brazenness of it, that they actually put Trump in charge of the so-called Board for Peace. But the general outlines are basically building on what Biden did. In May of 2024, the ICJ issued the last of its 3 resolutions, 3 orders, not opinions, orders to Israel to stop its then invasion of Rafah. The Algerians were reported to have started to draft a resolution to implement those orders, which I had expected that the U.S., that the Algerians would put forward and that the U.S. would veto, and then we could move to uniting for peace. Instead, what happened was that the U.S. stalled the Algerians, and then Biden came out and said, Netanyahu has agreed to a ceasefire. Hooray, hooray. The U.S. put forward its own resolution blessing its so-called negotiating process, which was an obvious farce, and everybody voted for it. I think the Russians abstained, but the Algerians put aside their own resolution, basically brushing aside the hard-won orders from the International Court of Justice. And I called this out at the time, and I think a lot of people in the peace movement and in the solidarity movement were taken in because they got wound up in this rhetoric of ceasefire, ceasefire, ceasefire. No, we don't just want a ceasefire. We want implementation of the court orders. And I think that was a critical mistake. And it allowed the U.S. to have this Oslo-like process with Qatar and Egypt as so-called mediators in these so-called negotiations that ended with Israel actually targeting with missiles the Palestinian negotiators. So it's been a farce from day one, and it's a great failure of the nations of the world that they didn't use uniting for peace in this instance, in this critical instance. And it's a failure, unfortunately, of the solidarity movement that it didn't organize itself. Clearly, the United States empire and Israel have a plan. And I'm sorry to say that many people, I think we need to take accounting here, many people on our side of the line here do not sufficiently have a strategic plan.
Yes, Mr. Husseini, but also Dr. Surani, I think talking of the strategic plan that Mr. Husseini speaks of as well. And if we take a step back and we go to February the 4th, where Trump vowed to take over, own the Gaza Strip, he spoke about the Riviera of the Middle East and all of that actually put together. And now that we've seen the United States leading the charge with this resolution, gaining the support without any veto, without any resistance in terms of implementing this plan. Has this given the United States the green light in what it calls the Board of Peace to run Gaza?
So what's the question?
No, I'm saying, has this resolution given the President Trump the green light for what he has been proposing for months and what his plans for Gaza has been?
He doesn't want any, to give him a green light. He's imposing it with his shoes. He's the president of the most mighty country on this earth. And he issued decree 2017 when he was first elected as a president. And with that, he designated the ICC prosecutor and sanctioned them. The one who charged the criminals were sanctioned. Second, he issued later 2 presidential decrees this year, immediately after he was elected. He sanctioned the 2 prosecutors and 5 judges at the ICC. And he designated 3 most credible Palestinian human rights organizations who represent victims at the ICC with the charges, simple charges. They are using the law and ICC. He didn't satisfy with that. But ICJ, International Court of Justice, after they took 3 provisional measures decisions, which should be implemented immediately by international community to end the famine and genocide related to providing immediate direct medical aid and humanitarian aid and food to the Gaza Strip. None of it has been.
Yes, I think we seem to have lost Mr. Surani. Perhaps, Mr. Husseini, perhaps, you'd like to comment on this as well in terms of the green light for Donald Trump, but also when one looks at the sequence of events that have taken place over a period of time. He was making noises about Gaza being the Riviera, and then came out with this outrageous 20-point plan. We knew that was very vague, that was very impractical, because he knew that Israel would actually violate the ceasefire from day one. And over a period of time, now we've seen this resolution as well. And just to look at it, from an American perspective, but also at the same time, knowing that whatever happens, Israel is not going to respect anything, whether it is going to be a peace plan, whether it's going to be a UN resolution that's going to be passed.
Yes, that's a lot there. And at the beginning, you asked about what this means for the world order. And I think that the assault on international law from the perspective of the U.S. establishment is a feature of what's going on here. That I think that this is a critical part of a wider attack on international law. People are sometimes confused by the U.S. establishment using the term rules-based order. That's not synonymous with international law. It's to replace it so that the set of rules that the U.S. empire utilizes at any particular point in time, it can invoke whatever rule it wants in order to fulfill what it wants. And in terms of the sequence of events, I outlined what I saw regarding the International Court of Justice rulings. But when Trump came in and started making noises about the Riviera and then seeming to back off, and in typical Trump style, going back and forth, you also had the role of the Saudi-French plan, which was sort of a more, a less brazen version of the Trump plan. So that sort of paved the way for his plan in order to push aside the possibility of uniting for peace. Again, all of this accelerated dramatically after Petro, the president of Colombia, talked about uniting for peace, and critically didn't seem to get a great deal of support. So you had Trump, triple down on this. To what extent this is implementable is another question. You have the capitulation of various parties, which we should talk about, but I mean, you do have Hamas and other Palestinian factions saying we're not going to disarm, as this thing stipulates. You're having the people who are being genocided having to relinquish the meager arms that some of them may have, and the genocidal party has absolutely no obligations placed upon it. So who exactly is going to do the U.S. dirty work, or if it's going to do it itself and get the U.S. involved, and then you have the prospect of, what U.S. soldiers or U.S. mercenaries, engaging in combat with Palestinians. Where's that going to lead? These are all the obvious questions if this thing is actually going to move forward.
Yes, Mr. Surani, I noticed that your camera obviously is in another direction, actually. If you could possibly just turn your screen so that we could, it's just, it's gone now completely upside down, actually. So you could just
Yes.
possibly to your right. If you could turn it to your right, I'm sure, we would get it right, actually. But
Keep going.
I think, yeah, I think obviously, from what you are saying, Mr. Husseini, also is the type of language that is being used in the resolution. It talks about a board of peace. It talks about an international stabilization force. Now, these are fancy terms that are being used, and to get people to actually buy in that there is a sincere effort for peace in Gaza by calling it a board of peace, by calling it a stabilization force. But the thing is, you can call anything by any name, but the reality reflects something totally different, because this is not your regular UN peacekeeping force like we've seen in Lebanon, we've seen in many other parts around the world. This is a force that has got a greater agenda that is playing out.
Yes, I mean, these are all Orwellian terms, almost comically Orwellian. We're going to have a board of peace, and Trump, who armed Israel to the max, is going to be the head of it. It's preposterous on its face. The purpose of this so-called stabilization force is largely to disarm Palestinians. It's not to protect them from the daily slaughter that they're still subjected to by Israel. It's not to ensure humanitarian aid delivery. It's none of the things that you would associate with a protection force or a meaningful peacekeeping force like there is in southern Lebanon, for example. There are obvious predecessors to what should have happened here. The UN used Uniting for Peace to resolve the 1956 Suez Crisis, when Israel and Britain and France invaded Gaza as well as the Sinai. And the US then and the Soviet Union teamed up and forced them out using the first ever UN peacekeeping force. So that would have been an obvious model for what we should have seen here. Another obvious model is the UN used Uniting for Peace to put sanctions on apartheid South Africa beginning in 1981. With the General Assembly chastising the Security Council for its failure to fulfill its proper function in this matter, and call for international military boycott, as well as broad-ranging economic and other sanctions. That should still be done here. So not all is lost. There is still the opportunity to use the General Assembly to do these things. But part of the problem is what has happened with the Security Council. We've mentioned that the Chinese and the Russians abstained rather than veto. That is, they refused to block this thing, even while they made statements about how bad it is. Some people claim that, maybe they're just letting the US go into a trap or whatever. Unfortunately, I perceive it that, this is not a core interest of Russia or China. A core interest of Russia is Ukraine. A core interest of China is Taiwan and other things close to its periphery. Or tariffs. So if they can get beneficial treatment by the Trump administration and Witkoff on matters like that, then they seem to be perfectly happy to just provide Palestine with rhetoric and little else. Again, I was warning about what Algeria was doing as of last year, when they put aside the alleged draft that they were working on to implement the ICJ orders. But that applies to all of these other Arab and Muslim countries. Pakistan also voted for this. And they're all under some form of thumb of the United States. Pakistan, you had Imran Khan ousted in Pakistan. So you have, a questionable legitimacy of a government there. All of these Arab regimes that the Chinese and the Russians said, oh, we can't, do, the Arabs are asking us to do this. Well, they're all appendages one way or another of the United States. The United States has spent the last several decades decapitating any Arab country that might be independent of whatever stripe, whether it's Iraq or Syria or Libya or whoever. They were all attacked in one form or another, so that what's left is basically Quislings and these subnational groups, Ansar Allah in Yemen, and Hezbollah, which itself was viciously attacked in Lebanon. And they're the only ones who are, standing up. And I mean, as a matter of fact, you have some Arab regimes, actually defending when you had, the so-called 12-day war, some missile exchange between Iran and Israel. This last summer, you had Arab governments like Jordan actually defending Israel while it was perpetrating a genocide on Palestinians, and while it was illegally bombing Iran. When Iran tried to retaliate, Jordan was, helping to knock out the Iranian missiles to defend Israel. So this is a very serious problem in the Arab world, that you have the regimes acting as U.S. and Israeli proxies, in effect. The so-called Abraham Accords were part of this, of course, and various deal cutting. You had, they normalized relations with Morocco at such a time so that the U.S. was backing up the Moroccan position in, in their domination of Western Sahara, for example, and them getting weapons to solidify that. So you have all of this corrupt deal making being done, but there are openings, and if I might, I mean, the other big problem is the Palestinian Authority itself.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Mr. Husseini, can we just go? I need to go for a quick ad break.
Oh, sure.
We'll come back, and I'd like to talk about the Palestinian Authority as well. And I think also looking at it from a Palestinian resistance perspective, because we know that the resistance obviously has rejected this resolution that has been passed. So we'll just take a look at it from a Palestinian perspective as well. So we'll go for a quick ad break. We'll be back in a minute.
Excellent.
In South Africa, countless numbers of sick patients leave their homes at the crack of dawn to join long queues at clinics and public hospitals, many of them suffering pangs of hunger in addition to the symptoms of disease. The Al-Imdad Foundation's Slice for Life teams deliver sandwiches to these patients at more than 40 hospitals and clinics across the country. Help us to keep on relieving hunger. Donate online at alimdad.com or call 0861 786 243 for more information.
Discover the Africa of your dreams and surround yourself with her spectacular beauty. Relax beneath her serene sunsets and explore wildlife at its natural best. It's where the pride of Africa comes together. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve. Get to know the Big Five or cruise on an elephant safari game drive. Interact with lion and tiger cubs and enjoy world-class halal cuisine while we pamper you during your 5-star stay. Indulge in the true African experience. For reservations, call now on 042 203 1400 or visit kwantu.co.za. The Kwantu Private Game Reserve, the place of gathering.
Penny Appeal's Education First campaign helps children to get access to quality education.
I'm 14 years old. When I grow up, I'd like to be a scientist.
We believe every child belongs at school,
And we want education, a better education.
learning and dreaming their way to a better future. With your help, we can provide classrooms, desks, stationery packs, and school shoes. Help make these dreams a reality. Visit www.pennyappeal.org.za or call 031 1100 573. Penny Appeal. Small change, big difference.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness, and every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and freezer card calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031 208 9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
Our brothers and sisters in Palestine are enduring unimaginable hardships. Ashraful Aid teams are on the ground, delivering crucial aid to those in need. But we can't do it alone. Palestine is suffering and they need your help. Your support can make a world of difference. Visit www.ashrafulaid.org today and donate to bring hope, relief, and healing to those who are in need.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media.
Well, we continue our broadcast this evening, and unfortunately, Dr. Surani could not connect, but we continue with my guest, Husseini, joining us this evening as we unpack the UN Resolution 2803. Mr. Husseini, just to move on, and we all know that Israel obviously has not achieved its stated aims and objectives in defeating the resistance in Gaza. In fact, some would say that it cost them more than just an arm and a leg, considering what it's done to Israel as a country, as a society, economically, mentally. It has been, it's affected Israel as well. But once again, through a resolution of this sort, getting other nations to do its dirty work, getting other nations to commit their military people, their soldiers on the ground, to commit their finances, their resources to this board of peace or the so-called peace plan. And once again, where does this leave the resistance? Because the resistance has obviously rejected this resolution outright.
Well, I think I might have a unique perspective in all of this. The term the resistance, when it's applied simply to the armed resistance, I view resistance as far broader than that. I view international solidarity, attempting to use protest, boycott, divestment, sanctions, international law, and so on as part of a meaningful resistance, and they need to be as strategic as any armed resistance fighters. I believe that Israel fulfilled its goals, its actual goals. It's, it has to pretend that it's fighting Hamas. And of course, it would have liked to have done an ethnic cleansing, a complete ethnic cleansing of Gaza. But fundamentally, its actual goal is to, damage Palestinian society as much as possible. And it did largely succeed in that. It is continuing to succeed in that. It is continuing to take more and more land from the West Bank, from the Palestinians there. It is continuing to subjugate and slaughter on a daily basis in Gaza. It has public opinion against it globally as never before. That's absolutely true. But we have not. But people of conscience have failed to organize ourselves sufficiently in order to translate that into meaningful action to prevent Israel from continuing its horrific crimes on a daily basis. And I feel that the tragedy of this, and I don't mean to argue that armed resistance is not legitimate. People under occupation have a complete right to armed resistance. That's a facet of international law, whether the US and Israel like it or not. But right now, it is at a level that it provides something of a pretext for Israel, should Israel need a pretext, without providing a sufficient deterrent to Israel, especially with Hezbollah in a somewhat hobbled state. Israel just attacked Beirut the other day, in addition to the 10,000 violations it's had against Lebanon since the other so-called ceasefire of a year ago. And similarly, Yemen, with this so-called ceasefire, I suppose, isn't injecting itself in the situation at this point. So, I mean, things could obviously escalate for good or bad in the near term. But as you say, not just Hamas, but also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and other groups, as well as Palestinian civil society, have completely derided this ridiculous resolution and the board of so-called ridiculously called Board of Peace. But a big problem is that you have the PA still sitting there, and the PA effectively in control of the Palestinian seat at the United Nations. So you have this crazy situation of countries at the UN which might do something good, like, back the Colombian proposal for Uniting for Peace and other things. They're being told almost certainly by the so-called Palestinian representative at the UN that they shouldn't do that, that they should get behind this Trump effort. So, the Palestinians people have, and I'm Palestinian, I speak about myself here, have to find a way to clean house here and to make clear to other countries that it's important, in a sense, that Palestine have a seat at the United Nations, because that opens up some avenues for redress, but that they should be listening to Palestinian people and civil society and other groups, and not necessarily at all to the so-called representatives sitting in New York or Ramallah. So this is a big problem.
Yes, but also I think just in terms of this resolution, Mr. Husseini,
Yes.
looking at a foreign force, how effective would a foreign force actually be, or would they just become another layer of occupation where the focus would be to demilitarize Palestinians rather than, constrain Israel? Because at this point in time, this is a nation that is acting with impunity. It's a nation that has gone rogue. And you cited Lebanon as an example. and the very same thing could also happen in Gaza?
Absolutely. I mean, the stated goals of this so-called stabilization force is to disarm the Palestinian groups. You know, they're not trying to hide that. So I don't know, but I would imagine that you're not. I mean, Indonesia initially said that they were willing to send 20,000 troops, and I initially had hoped that that was for a protection force, as envisioned by Colombia. I don't know if Indonesia is planning on sending troops into the stabilization force, and if their orders are going to be, you know, you go in there and you disarm Hamas and Islamic Jihad, or if it's going to be U.S. soldiers going in there, and then you have U.S. soldiers in firefights with Al Qassam brigades. And then does that become a pretext for more direct U.S. intervention? That Trump can go out there and saying Hamas killed this brave U.S. soldier, and then that becomes a trigger for more massive U.S. Military intervention. These are some of the possible nightmare scenarios, or at least nightmare for the Palestinians. Maybe other people will take some delight in the U.S. Getting dragged into such a conflict. But the Palestinian factions at this point are speaking quite clearly. I should say, to criticize them, they were not speaking clearly a year ago. When the ICJ order came down in May of 2024, and then the U.S. put forward its phony resolution, Hamas welcomed that. That was a huge mistake. Hamas should not have welcomed that. Hamas should have said, no, we want implementation of the ICJ orders. We don't want these so-called, U.S. Sponsored talks, because you could see where they were. At least I could see where they were going to lead to. Maybe people in Hamas and people around them in Gaza were getting slaughtered on a daily basis and having their family members killed on a daily basis. Were in a more desperate state and couldn't see clearly through the farce. But unfortunately, I believe that it was fairly clear.
Yes. Also, I think another important point that one needs to take into account is the victims' rights, their rights to justice, their rights to reparations, and also in terms of holding Israel accountable for what we've seen happening in the last 2 years.
Absolutely. There should be meaningful distribution of justice to the criminal perpetrators in the Israeli government and their collaborators in the U.S. and other governments, the companies that back them up, and there should be restitution for the victims. There is some measure of about this in UN resolutions in terms of land that's been expropriated, for example, in the West Bank by Israel, at least. But it should be far broader than that in terms of the pain and suffering, in terms of the damage to property, which is monumental, in terms of the slaughter of people and their loved ones. So the U.S. is not a signatory to the ICC, nor is Israel, but Palestine is. And I should say this was a very long process. The ICC for years refused to recognize that Palestine was recognizing the jurisdiction of the ICC. And finally, they were kind of dragged kicking and screaming to recognize it. And now you have Israel and the U.S. attacking the ICC regularly. There might be other, judicial mechanisms that could address this. The UN General Assembly, as part of a Uniting for Peace resolution, could pass a tribunal could be part of a resolution to call for economic sanctions, arms embargo, a protection force conceivably, although that's made more complicated by the recent UN Security Council resolution, and a tribunal to prosecute Israelis and others for their criminal activity. That could come out of a Uniting for Peace General Assembly resolution with a 2/3 vote. And I want to emphasize one last thing. I mean, the U.S. has delighted in doing everything behind the scenes of corrupt deals and paying off people and threatening people and so on. Part of the reason you want a meaningful Uniting for Peace resolution is it drags everything into the sunlight. You know, a meaningful resolution with such provisions, and every country's got to vote yes or no. And then every country's got to face its public to say, yeah, we voted against this resolution to meaningfully redress Israel's genocide, and they've got to explain it to their public. I want to see how that plays out in various capitals around the world. That when people say globalize the Intifada, that's what I think about, to find the mechanisms to hold every government accountable for its conduct.
Well, one thing that, and one big lesson that we've learned from Gaza, it's basically the experience has dragged a lot out into the sunlight, and it's exposed a lot. It's exposed the hypocrisy of world bodies, of governments, of leaders. And just finally, interesting, when we speak about who the Arab world would actually prefer to govern Gaza or Palestine or the whole of Palestine. And when one looks at the recent developments, Donald Trump talking about the Muslim Brotherhood and designating them as a terrorist organization now, it also becomes ideological for the Arab world, because many of them have been very skeptical. They've been very suspicious of the Muslim Brotherhood. And we know that the Muslim Brotherhood obviously very closely associated with some of the resistance groups as well, where they resonate a lot with many of the Palestinian people as well, in terms of ideology as well. So, another dynamic that could possibly be playing out, particularly when one looks at it from an Arab perspective, and how the Arab world or the Arab leadership in those parts of the world actually view the Palestinians and who should be governing the people of Palestine.
Yes, well, I mean, the whole U.S. and Israeli project is to make sure that the Arabs and other people aren't the masters of their own fate, and that they're subjugated. And, now they are attacking groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas and so on. But when, you had, the left in ascent, they were attacking leftist groups. They will attack anyone and anything that tries to assert a level of independence. I think it's now the case that it's these Muslim groups, and so they are going to be attacked. I think that there's an anti-Muslim aspect to the attack, but it's more an anti-independence aspect to it. I mean, the U.S. loves so-called Muslims like, the leaders of the Gulf states, who, do their corrupt deals and their corrupt bidding, and they call themselves Muslims, just like Trump calls himself a Christian. But they're, they're not embodying the great values of any faith.
Well, Mr. Husseini, time is obviously of the essence, and time certainly has ended, and really it's gone by so quickly. It's a pity that we couldn't continue a lot longer. There's just so much to unpick, but I'm sure at some point in time, we will connect once again. But we certainly are following these developments. But once again, from ourselves, we do appreciate you taking time out for us here at Salam Media and being part and parcel of this discussion. And hope we, obviously will catch up at some point in time again. But for now, we do appreciate your time. All the best to you, sir.
Always a pleasure speaking with you. Salam.
Walaikum salam. Sam Husseini joining us this evening right here on Salam Media, which brings us to the end of tonight's edition of In Conversation with myself, Inayat Wadi. Until we meet again, from myself and the team, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.